Good morning, guys. Today we'll be discussing what's in research one from what we have left off from the last lectures. If you remember, in the last lectures we have been discussing about what is research. We have defined what research is from different perspectives. And then we have discussed about different types of research, and we discussed about the ethical principles that we have to consider in conducting research and a couple of other topics. So today we'll continue with what we have left from, and today we'll be discussing about 5 basic points. The first point will be we are going to discuss what is the research process, or what are the basic steps that you have to follow in conducting a research. If you remember in the previous lectures, we have said that research is a scientific process, meaning we need to follow certain steps, scientific steps designed. But this is not the only steps that is available on the tables. Different authors developed different types of steps. We have a couple of other research processes, but the concept is more or less similar. So today we'll be discussing about the research process, what are the basic steps that we need to follow in conducting a research, and we'll be discussing about each of these steps in detail. And then the second step, or the second point, will be discussing about the elements or components of a proposal, and we'll discuss in detail some of the elements in the next slides, and we'll be discussing about 5 pointers for today's lecture. So let's start with the research process, and let's see what are these 10 steps in conducting research. The first step is to identify a research problem. This step will help you in problem solving research, not in a problem identifying type of research. If you remember the previous classes, when we define or when we categorize research, we have said there are 2 types of research, basically problem identification research and problem solving research. So in the second one, we are going to have these basic 10 steps. So these steps will help you in solving a certain problem that is encountered by or faced by a certain company or a certain market. So the first step is identifying the research problem and setting objectives. So when you identify a problem, what are the basic criteria that you are going to see, how you are going to develop these problems, how you are going to identify the problems will be discussed in the next slides. But this is the first step, identifying the research problems and setting objectives. The second step, after identifying the research problem, the second step will be reviewing and checking literatures that relates with your subject matter, or with your study. So this literature reviews will give you more detailed information about your problem, your subject issue, and so on. So you can develop your problems further, and then you will see how you are going to approach or how you are going to tackle the problem. So it will help you in there. So the second step is you have to identify and you have to review literatures that relates with your subject or your study. The third step, after reviewing your literature, is you are going to design research design, or you are going to prepare research design. Research design is structure that we'll be discussing about in next lecture. So you are going to prepare research design that will help you, or that will show you the ways how you are going to tackle the problems, how you are going to approach your researches. So the research design is the third step that you are going to design or develop. The fourth step is you are going to prepare and develop a proposal or the research plans. It is the blueprint of your research. When you say proposal or research plan, it is the blueprint of your research. It is the base. It will show you how you are going to conduct your research, who's going to conduct the research, when you are going to do what, and so on. So the proposal is the blueprint of your research. Think about it like this. Let's say you want to build a certain building or a certain structure. So before you build that structure or building, you need to have a blueprint, that will show you how many rooms it will have, how high it is, what will be the structure of that building, and so on. So it is based on that blueprint you are going to develop your building. So it's the same thing when you come to a research. You need to have a blueprint that will show you how you are going to conduct the research, when you are going to conduct the research, what will be the structures, and so on. So it is a document that will show you the way in the future. So that is the fourth step. The fifth step is you are going to develop and design data collection instruments or tools. So when you think of designing or developing the data collection instrument or tools, it is basing on the research problem. It is basing on your proposals. So we have different types of data collection instruments or tools, which we are going to discuss it in the next lectures. So we have to develop and design your data collection instruments or tools in this fifth step, because whenever you think of solving a problem, you have to investigate about that problem further and more. So you will have a certain understanding what causes that specific problems. So this is one important aspect of the research. So after developing your data collection instrument or tools, you have to conduct a test. You have to make sure your data collection instrument is reliable and it is fit for your research to collect the data, basically primary data. When you say data, you have two types of data: primary data and secondary data. Of course there are tertiary data, but it's better if you focus on the two, primary data and secondary data. So you have to make sure your data collection tools fits to collect that primary data, the necessary data to tackle and solve your problems. So we are going to pilot tests to make sure it is appropriate. So this is sixth step. The seventh step, after testing and editing your data collection instruments or tools, you are going to collect data from your respondents. So your respondents might be customers, it might be the management, it might be employees or suppliers or the public or the society. So based on the research plan that you have, based on the problem, based on the research design that you have in place, you are going to collect those data, primary and secondary data. So actually it's not data, it is data when it becomes plural. Anyways, you are going to collect data, and after collecting the data, you are going to analyze and interpret what you have collected. So when you think of analysis, we have basically two types of analysis. We have qualitative and we have quantitative analysis. So when you say quantitative analysis, or when you say quantitative data analysis techniques, it is a technique that you are going to use to analyze numbers. You have descriptive, you have inferential in classifications and so on, but it is about the quantities, about the numbers. When you say qualitative data analysis technique, it is when the data that we have collected is quantitative type, qualitative type, like that of interviews and so on, open-ended questions most of the time. So we have two types of analysis techniques: qualitative data analysis technique and quantitative data analysis technique. So you are going to analyze the data that you have collected, and you are going to interpret it, meaning you have to give meaning for the analysis. You have to interpret those things. What does it mean? What does this data shows you? If you remember the first classes, we have differentiated data and information, and we have said the data is the raw factors and figures, while information is the process data. So in the process, in converting the data into information, this is the basic step: analysis and interpretation steps. If you don't give meaning for your analysis, it doesn't mean anything. It doesn't. It might not show you a solution. So you have to give an interpretation. And the ninth step is you have to write up the report as your findings as it is. After interpreting the data, after interpreting the analysis, you are going to write what you have find out, your findings, and you are going to report for the information users, and you are going to follow up with that. I hope it will give you certain clarity in the steps. So the second element is about the proposal elements, or what are the basic issues that you are going to consider in writing your proposals. So we have about 17 elements. So starting from the title to the appendices, so we have 17 steps. So let's say some of them. Actually, we'll be discussing about these things in the next lecture. So let's not waste time in going through all of these things, because from now on our lectures will focus on these basic steps. So let's discuss about a couple of it, and let's go to the next topic. So the first element is about your titles, the title page, or your subject of investigation, or your topic, your research title. So this research title shows you about your study, what is the subject matter that you like to research on, and so on. So this is an statement that will show you what is the subject matter of your research study. The other element is the abstract. So it is optional, of course. So the abstract is an executive summary of your research, the whole research. So most of the time, the abstract will be written after the completion of your research, but you could edit it now and then. But the abstract is the executive summary, an executive summary of your research. So it is an optional. And this abstract will give you hints on the overall research, meaning it includes about your background. It will discuss about your subject matters, what is your investigation, about your titles. It will discuss about the methodology that you are using, about your population, about your research result, about the findings or the results, about the problem, and so on. So this is kind of a summary of your research, the whole research. So it is optional, but I advise you to include abstracts in your papers or in your proposals. And The other element is about background of the study. So when you say background of the study, it is a a theoretical aspect. So it is an introduction part to your study. What are you studying? What are the investigations and so on? Let's say if you are working on advertisements, or in the background of the study, you will discuss about advertising, how we are going to approach those things, and so on. So it will give you an introduction part. It will give you a highlight about your title of investigation or about your study. So the other element is statement of the problem. If you remember the research process, we have said it is the first step is identifying the research problem. So in the proposal stage, you are going to write your problem statement of the problem, to the rationales that you are going to have. So we'll discuss about problem assessment and title in the next slide, so let's not waste time on these things. But what we are not, I mean, the other basic important element is the research questions, objective of the study. We have significance of the study and the others. So we'll be discussing about these elements in the next slides, as well as in the next lectures. So let's jump to our topic, the research title, or the research topic. So let's just say that your research title or your research topic is a gateway to your research or to your work. So why do you think it is called it is a gateway to your research or to your work? We'll come back to that, but I want to discuss on the reasons behind it is a gateway to your research or to your work. So I'll come back to that later, but let's discuss about how you are going to select a research title or a research topic. So first of all, in selecting the research title or the research topic, you have to in selecting your research title or your research topics, you have to consider or you have to see three basic things. The first one is your interest. Do you have interest to conduct a research in that specific topics, or do you have a motivation to conduct a research in that specific subject matter? So that's the first one, your interest. So I'll come back to how you are going to write your research titles. I'll give you two cases, but let's focus on the theoretical aspects for now, and in the next slides we'll be discussing about the cases with examples, how we are going to develop it. But the first thing is you have to know your interest at this stage. So let's say you took about a couple of courses, 10, 12 marketing courses. So which subject influences you, which subject motivates you, and makes you interested to conduct the research on? So that's the first one, because if you don't have interest, the second steps is it doesn't help you that much. So that's the first one. The second thing that you are going to consider is the literatures. Do I have literatures? Do I have enough secondary data in there? If you remember the first slides when we discussed about the research, the second step is you have to review necessary and related literatures, right? So you have to know whether you are able to acquire enough literatures in that specific subject matter. Let's say you might be interested to conduct a research on guerrilla marketing, or viral marketing, or some other subjects, right? But you have to ask one thing: am I able to acquire literatures on these subject matters? It's not just about interest, but you have to also make sure that you are able to acquire the literatures in that subject matters. Then the third thing that you are going to focus on is, am I able to acquire primary data, or am I able to collect primary data from company, from company managers, from employees, from customers, and from different sources? So, am I able to do that? So you have to understand these three things before you start conducting a research. I'm discussing about academic researches, all right? So you have to understand these basic things. Do I have interest? Am I able to acquire literatures? And am I able to acquire primary data from companies and other sources? So if the answer for these three questions is yes, then you are ready to write your research, to write your titles, and so on. Actually, at least you will be ready to write your titles and to make further investigations if not conducting the research. So, in writing your research title or your research topics, there are certain criteria that you need to follow when you write your titles or your research. All right. So let's discuss about why the research title or the research topic is known as it's a gateway to the research or to your work. The first thing that you will read before write before reading the research work is your titles. If your title is not interactive, if your title is not understandable, if your title is not attractive, then no one will be motivated to read your research. So I'll come back to that with more details, with examples later on. So uh, let's see the criteria, some of the criteria that you need to follow in writing your research titles or your research topics. So the first criteria is your title should not be too broad or too narrow, meaning it should be broad, of course, but it should not be too broad and should not be too narrow to work the research. It should be moderate. Let's say if you want to conduct a research on let's say promotion, right? Promotion is a little wider, so you have to minimize it to a workable stage. And when you say it should not be too broad or too narrow, it means in terms of finance, in terms of time, and so on. You should be able to uh, conduct the research with the time frame that you have and with the finance that you have. So it should not be that much broad so that it will not confuse you in which variables you are going to focus on, and it should not be too narrow so that you will not be able to acquire enough information about the variables or the subject matters. So it should be somehow moderate. We'll discuss about this with examples in the next slide. All right. The second thing that you are going to consider in writing your research title and your research topic is that you should avoid acronyms, abbreviations, and that of initials. So when you say acronyms, it is a short form of this the statement. Actually, when you say acronyms, abbreviations, and initials, it is the short term or the short form of a certain word or statement. But the difference between acronym, abbreviation, and that of initial is that when you say acronyms, when you discuss about acronyms, it means the short form will be used as a word, will be read as a word. When you say abbreviations, you are going to mention each alphabet in the short form. And when you say initials, you are not going to read each alphabet, or you are not going to use the short form as a word, but you are going to read the original phrase or the original term. So when you say UNESCO in a statement, when you read when you find UNESCO or UNESCO in a statement, you are going to read UNESCO as a word. You are not going to mention each word as UNESCO. You don't do that. So you just read it as a word, UNESCO. So if you read the short form as a word, it is known as acronyms. UNESCO stands for United Nations Economic, Social, and cultural organization. So you are using the short form as a word, UNESCO, right? So that is acronym. When you say abbreviation, you are going to mention each alphabet as uh, as it is mentioned. So if you read SMU in assessments, you are going to mention each alphabet. You are not going to read it as a word. You are not going to say SMU or some other terms. You are going to uh, read each alphabet like SMU, but SMU stands for a certain phrase, St. Mary's University, and so on. But when you say initials, for instance, if you see dr dot in a statement, you are not going to read it as dr, or you are not going to read it as a word, but you are going to mention the original name, doctor, right? So this is the difference between acronym, abbreviation, and that of initials. But you should avoid these phrases, these short hands, acronyms, abbreviations, and that of initials, unless and otherwise it is known worldwide. It doesn't mean that you should avoid any acronyms, abbreviations, or initials. If it is known worldwide, then you can use it in your title. Otherwise, you should avoid it. Let's say SC stands for share company, right? S.C stands for share company. So let's say if your title is uh, let's assume your title is an assessment of green marketing in the case of a certain share company. So you are not going to write an assessment of green marketing in the case of XYZ share company. Instead, you are going to use the initials S.C. So you can use these shorthands if it is known worldwide. Otherwise, you should avoid acronyms, abbreviations, and initials. The third criteria in writing your research title or your research topic is that you should avoid redundant and unnecessary words. Sometimes there are unnecessary words, so you should avoid these unnecessary words or redundant words in your title. So you should not use some words over and over again in your title. It will make it a little bit unattractive. So you should avoid those things. The fourth uh, criteria that you need to consider is that uh, indication of variables is mandatory in your title or in your topics. When you write your research title or your research topics, you should indicate the variables. What are the subject matters of your study? What are the subjects that needs to be investigated or that needs to be researched in your papers? So you should indicate the variables, all the variables in your research. Actually, we have three types of variables. dependent variable, we have independent variable, and then we have intermediary variable. So you should indicate these variables. At least you need to indicate dependent variable in a lot of independent variables in your research titles. The other criteria that needs consideration is use known or familiar words from the field of the study. Let's say if you are conducting a research in marketing, use terminologies or words that is known in the field of study in marketing. I mean, so it will attract readers in that field of study, or you'll have a reader about your researches. The last thing that you need to consider is you should focus on subjects that are timely and current issues, so that you could maximize the readers. If it's not timely and if it is not current, then there is no use investing your research. Whenever you think of your research, whenever you think of conducting a research, you should think about the 4 principles that we have discussed, the ethical principles. So just for your revision, the 4 ethical principles includes one, objectivity principle, and then when you say objectivity principle, it means you should avoid subjectivity, meaning you should avoid objectivity, meaning that you should not include any of your interest in your research. So that is objectivity principle. The second component that you need to think is should be thorough, or thoroughness principle. So when you say thoroughness principles, it means that everything should be in detail. You should write your findings in detail. You should write about your methodology in detail, and so on. So that's why it is mandatory to indicate the variables starting from your research topic or from your research titles. The third principle is truthfulness principle. So when you say truthfulness principle, you should write what you have observed or what you have acquired. You should not deceive the readers and so on, some other users of your research. So truthfulness principle. What's the last principle? Good. Relevance principle. So when you say relevance principle, it means your research topic should be relevant, or should have a certain benefit, or your research should have certain benefit. So if your research should have a benefit or certain value, it is when it is timely, or when it is a current issue. When that topic is current issue, then the value will increase, and you will not be violating the 4 principles that we have mentioned and that we have discussed in the previous lectures. So let's go to the examples, the cases for discussion, how you are going to write your research titles or your research topics. So let's say your interest is on promotion, as we said, because you have to identify the interests, we have to see the literatures, and you have to make sure you are going to acquire primary data. So let's say you passed all these 3 basic criteria, and you want to write your research on promotion. So the first thing that you are going to do is you are going to structure out the variables, or the elements that you could work on. So when you say promotion, you could work on advertising, you could work on sales promotion, you could work on PR, public relation, and publicity, and a couple of other promotion tools or promotion mixes. So let's focus on the 3 for for the sake of the lecture. So when you say promotion, you have advertisement or advertising, you have sales promotion, you have public relation. And again, your interest is on advertising, let's say. You could work on print advertising, you could work on broadcast advertising, you could work on transport advertising or vehicle advertising or moving advertising, you could work on new media advertising and so on. So after structuring in this way, the other step is you are going to follow the criteria that we have discussed in this step, and we are going to write your title. So let's see the first one, right? You could say a study of an assessment of sales promotion strategy development effectiveness, the case of a certain company, right? Let's say this is a title. So let's evaluate this title based on the criteria that we have discussed so far. We have said that there are 6 criteria that you need to see. So let's start with the easiest one, all right? Is there any acronyms, abbreviations, or initials in the first title? It says a study of an assessment of sales promotion strategy development effectiveness, the case of a certain company or certain industry. I'm sure it is visible that there is no acronyms, there is no abbreviations or initials in the first title, so we can ignore that. There's no acronym. So let's say, is it redundant words used or unnecessary words used in the first case? Can identify any redundant words or any unnecessary words that is used in the first title. So as you can see, there are a study of an assessment of, so it is the same, a study of an assessment of, so you could use any of the two. You could say a study of sales promotion, or you could say an assessment of sales promotion. So there are redundant words in there. And again, effectiveness, you could neglect study of and an assessment of both, and you could just say effectiveness of. It's simple. So there are redundant words in the first one. Is the variables indicated or not? Of course it is indicated. You are discussing about sales promotion strategy development, right? So the variables are indicated somehow. So what is lacking is we are redundant. We are using redundant words. Of course, it is familiar words. The words are familiar in the research study. So there are certain up and downs in the first case. What if you write the first title as this one, the second title, all right? Effectiveness of sales promotion strategy development, the case of a certain company. Now you avoid redundant words. Of course, there is no study of an assessment of, so these are redundant words. So you could just say effectiveness of sales promotion strategy development, right? So you could avoid redundant words. If there are any acronyms or abbreviations, again, there is no acronyms and abbreviations mentioned, and the variables are mentioned and so on. Is it broad or is it narrow? It depends on the finance that you have, it depends on the time that you have, it depends on your capacity, it depends on your understanding about the subject matters, how you are going to study it. So the broadness or the narrowness depends on the finance and the time that you have and the capacity that you have. Otherwise, the others are mentioned. So the first title is redundant, but the second title is not redundant. The first title is a little bit confusing, but the second title is somehow clearer. So let me ask you one thing: which title would you be interested to read on? I mean, which research would you be interested to read on, the first or the second title? I'm sure it is the second title, so that's why we said a research title or research topic is a gateway for your works and for your research. Let's go to the third title, the third example. It says an assessment of advertising practice, the case of a certain company. So can you evaluate these titles based on the criteria that we have mentioned earlier? So you could write your titles in this way, or write the fourth title, an assessment of print media advertising practice, the case of a certain company or a certain industry, and you could write it in this way, and you could evaluate your topics. Let's see the last topic. It says the impact of promotion on sales volume, the case of a certain company. So is it too broad or too narrow? Does it have any redundant words or any other things you could evaluate it in this way? But let me discuss one thing in here, and we'll pass to the second case. When you say the impact of promotion on sales volume, if you see the structure, promotion is a very wide subject. We have advertising, we have sales promotion, we have PR and publicity, and we have some other promotion tool that is not mentioned in this slide. So when you discuss about the impact of promotion on sales volume, of course there are dependent and independent variables. The dependent variable is sales volume, and the independent variable is the promotion in this case. But which promotion you are going to focus on? I mean, when you try to study the promotion impact is on the sales volume, as you see in the structure, we have different types of promotion tools, or we have different promotional mixes. So it will be a little bit broad for you to conduct this type of research based on the finance and the time that you have. So it is too broad, so it is better to minimize it in moderate means. But if you say like this, for instance, the impact of broadcast advertising on sales volume, the case of like that, it is somehow better. It's a little bit moderate compared to this title, so you could write your titles in this ways. But these are the evaluation criteria that you are going to use in writing your research topic or your research title. So let's see one more case, and let's finalize about titles, our discussion on titles. So the second case that I've selected is a service. So again, let's assume you have passed the three criteria, meaning you have interest, you can acquire literatures, and it's possible for you to acquire or obtain primary data. So the same case as the first one, we are going to disintegrate how we are going to see the service, how we are going to approach it. You could work on service development, you could work on service recovery, you could work on customer service, you could work on service pricing. And when you say customer service, we have before sales service, we have on sales service, and we have after sales service, and so on. So after structuring the subject matter in this way, what is left is you are going to write the topics or the titles based on the criteria that we have been discussing so far. So let's evaluate these four topics, and let's see which one fits to be a research topic or a research title. Okay, so let's discuss about the first title. It says the impact of service development strategy, the case of a certain company or a certain industry. What could you say about the first title based on the criteria that we have been discussing so far before I give you my explanations. Let's take a little time in this. Think about the first title, the impact of service development strategy, the case of a certain company or a certain industry, based on the criteria that we have discussed so far, based on these criteria. So is it too broad? Is it too narrow? Does it have any acronyms? Is there any redundant words? Uh, is the variables indicated or the other criteria? Okay, so when you think of the first title, what comes to your mind in the first case is where is the other variable? Where is the dependent or the independent variable? When you say impact or when you say impact, it is a causal research type. It is cause and effect types. So which one is a cause and what effect does it have? Which one is the dependent and which one is the independent variable? Can you differentiate the dependent and the independent variables on the first one, the impact of service development strategy? On what? So the service development strategy might be independent variable, but what about the dependent variable? Where is the dependent variable? So it doesn't fit to be a research topic or a research title. Let's see the second one. By the way, can you fix the first title? Can you make it attractive? The impact of service development strategy. You could try those things, and we'll discuss about it in some other times. Okay. Let's see the second topic or the second title. It says effective strategy development for customer attraction and retention. The case of, again, a certain company or in a certain industry. It discusses about the effect. Okay, effective service development, meaning you are discussing about the service development process, the service as a product. Okay, so does it have any relation, service development and that of customer attraction and retention? Of course, it has a certain relation. So when you think of this, it indicates both the dependent and the independent variable. Can you identify the dependent variable and the independent variable in this case? Okay, so the independent variable is a service development, and the dependent variable is customer attraction and retention. So it indicates both the variables, doesn't use redundant words, doesn't use acronyms or abbreviations, and so on. As I said, the broadness, meaning the scope, depends on the time and the finance that you have and the capacity that you have. So it fits to be a good research topic or a good research title. What about the third one? Can you evaluate it in such way? An assessment of service development practice, the case of, again, a certain company or a certain industry. Good. Okay. And the fourth one, the last one, the effect of service pricing on, it is somehow similar that we have been discussing so far. So you could design and you could write your research topics and your research titles based on the criteria that we have discussed so far, and this is how you are going to write a topic. All right, so for discussion there's one title, one research topic that I come across in the department, is submitted in the department before 3 years actually, and it says a study of an assessment of distribution channel system effectiveness of soap detergent in the case of Rep-E detergent factory. Can you evaluate this research topic or the research title based on the criteria that we have been discussing so far and come up with a title, a good title that fits the criteria. Okay, so you can discuss on these issues and forward it um, on the inbox, and we can discuss on it. The second the third topic that we'll be discussing about is how we are going to write a research problem, how we are going to identify a research problem. So before we see the criteria and how we are going to write a research problem, let's discuss what a research problem is first, okay? It says the second paragraph, it says a research problem is a statement that needs to be addressed and solved at the end of the research, meaning it is a certain statement, it is a certain issue that you are going to solve after conducting your research. If you remember the research process, we have said the first step is identifying the research problem, so that you could solve that research problem or that specific problem. So it is inconsistency observed between the theoretical parts and that of the practical parts. It is a gap between the theory and that of the practice. When you say a problem statement, it is inconsistency or anomaly that you have observed or that it is observed between the theory and that of the practice in the company or in the industry. So in general terms, when you say research problem, it is a statement that you are going to provide a solution for at the end of conducting your research. So if you have identified your research problem correctly, if the problem is identified well, then 50% of your research is completed. The 50% of your work depends on the first stage or the first step of your research, identifying your research problem. So you need to give emphasis in identifying your research problems or statement of the problem, because if your statement of the problem if your research problem is not identified well, then whatever solution you come up with, whatever the finding will be, you will never solve the problem. So you have to give emphasis on identifying your research problem. So basically, when you write your research problems, there are three basic parts that you need to consider. The first is the theory, that discusses about the subject matters or the variables and the dimensions in the subject matters. The second part will be your the practice, meaning how does the company practice it, or what's the practice in that specific industry about the subject matters. And the third will be the gap. Let's say if you are discussing about wait, let's go back to previous slides. Good. So if you are discussing about service development, let's say for instance, there are theories that discusses about the service development process, how the service will be developed, what are the basic variables that needs to be considered in developing a service, and so on. So after discussing about the theories, you are going to discuss about the practice. This is the theory. When you develop a service, there are certain steps, step 1, step 2, step 3, and so on. This is what you should consider when you develop a service and so on. This is the theoretical part. So the practical part is how does the company develop a service? What are the basic things that the company observes in developing a service, and if it is industry, how a service is developed in that specific industry. So this is the second part. So when you say gap, it is the discrepancy between, or the difference between the theory and that of the practice. So that is statement of the problem. How we are going to write the statement of the problem. Basically, you need to see three parts of the theory, the practice, and that of the gap. So in writing your statement of the problem, there are different criteria, or there are different issues that you need to consider. So the first thing is, when you write your statement of the problem or problem statement, you should indicate all the possible variables. Okay, you should indicate the basic variables or the possible variables that might be a reason for the problem to exist. So you should indicate all the possible variables in your statement of the problem. The second thing that you need to consider in writing your statement of the problem is it should be self-explanatory, meaning it should explain the problems that is observed or seen in a company or in the industry without any help from the writer. Anyone could be able to read and understand the problem that is written in that specific research. So it should be self-explanatory, meaning the readers should not be forced to look for the writer or any other help in understanding the statement of the problem. Should be explained well, should be detailed. Third criteria in writing your statement of the problem is you should not mention or state the results, meaning you should mention the symptoms. You should indicate the symptoms only, because if you know the results already, you don't have to conduct a research. If you remember the previous lectures, in the previous classes, we have said a research is conducted to understand the unknown, or to know the unknown, to find out what is ahead of us, meaning you are going to conduct a research by starting from the unknown to the known. Okay, this is the process. You don't know something about the issue, so when you conduct a research, you'll understand about that specific issue. But if you already know the results, if you already know what's ahead of you, you don't have to conduct a research. So in writing the assessment of the problem, you don't have to state the result, you don't have to mention the result. Instead, you should mention the symptoms. You should show the symptoms for that specific possible causes. All right, so you should not mention results in your statement of the problem. The fourth criteria, or the fourth issue that you need to remember, is that in writing your problem statement, you should indicate how the problem is identified, meaning what is the source of that specific problem. Is it based on your observation, something that you have observed? Is it the customers, is it the management, is it the employee, or the public, or some source? All right, you have to mention how did you identify that problem, how did you work, or how did you arrive on that specific problem. You should indicate these things. If you see papers, or if you see articles, some says based on the preliminary study conducted. So that preliminary study could be observation, it could be a mini interview, or some sort. All right, so you should indicate what is the source, how did you identify that problem, and lastly, you should align, or your statement of the problem should be in line with that of the topic or the research title. Let's say if your research title is about advertising, in the statement of the problem, what you should mention is about advertising and variables that relates with advertising. Uh, you don't have to write about service development in your statement of the problem while your title is advertising or some other sorts. Okay, so your statement of the problem should align with the research topic or the research problem. So you could discuss on one case in 1917. Okay, in 1917, in 1980s, Coca-Cola failed to make progress in sales, meaning Coca-Cola company changed the package as you see it at the bottom right corner. You see two packets. So the Coca-Cola company changed this package from the previous one to new package that just says Coke instead of Coca-Cola. The package just says Coke. So nothing has been changed other than the brand. So what Coke studied is Coca-Cola has distributed 200,000 questionnaires for customers, all right? And the company just changed its flavor in the package, but what Coca-Cola has not realized is that it's not just taste that matters. It's not just the product taste that matters in convincing your customers, in attracting and retaining customers, but some other variables too. If you remember the previous discussion, we have said in the statement of the problem, you should indicate all the variables, all the possible variables, right? But what Coca-Cola has done is it only focuses, or it took only one factor or one variable as the main indicator or the main variable, but it's not just taste that matters. We have other variables that needs to be considered to package, brand, and so on. So you should see, or you should indicate, or you should come up with the possible variables before working on your statement of the problem, or before designing statement of the problem. So you should indicate the variables and so on. So this is one example in 1970s and in 1980s that happened in that years regarding Coca-Cola. The rest you can read it and you could understand what the problem is. Okay, later actually Coca-Cola company has changed this package to Coca-Cola Classic, you know, the package that you see on the right side. Okay, so this is just a case example that will help you to understand how you are going to write statement of the problem. I provide you with two case examples. So case one is it's about statement that is worked on brand equity. So you can see how it is written, but there are some drawbacks because you have said in the problem statement you should indicate basically three parts or three things. The first one is theory, practice, and that of gap. But in here you might not be able to see the theoretical aspects, meaning the variables and the dimensions in that specific problem or in that specific subject. And when you discuss about the gap, we have said it should be self-explanatory. You should be able to read and understand the problem without any help from the writers and so on. The rest you can evaluate it yourself. The second case, it is about service gap, service quality using gap model. As you see, we have the theoretical parts. For instance, the first, the second, and the third paragraph is theory. The theoretical aspect is about gap model, and you can see how it is practiced and so on, and then you can understand the gap that or the problem that is observed. Again, we have said you should indicate how you have identified the problem. So in the first case, it doesn't mention how the problem has been identified, and in the second case, if you see the last paragraph, it says based on the preliminary study conducted by the student researcher and so on. So it indicates how the problem has been identified. So this is two cases. You can read it and evaluate it yourself. So in short, when you write statement of the problem, you should indicate the other criteria. So the last issue for today's lecture is the research question, how you are going to design your research question and so on. So a research question is, it is an issue, it is a subject that needs to be addressed at the end of the research to solve the problem that has been mentioned. So when you write your research question, there are certain criteria that you need to be considering, but the title, the problem statement, the research question, and the others should be in line with it. All right, we have said the statement of the problem should in line with the research topic or the research title, and your research question should be in line with the problem statement. So indirectly, it should be in line with the research topic. So the criteria are as follows. So the first criteria is your research question should emanate from the statement of the problem or from the problem statement. If you design your problem statement correctly, then it will be easier to design and develop your research questions. The second criteria is that you should avoid dichotomous questions. When you say dichotomous questions, it means yes or no questions, all right? It only has two alternatives. For instance, if you say, does the company blah blah blah, then the answer will be yes or no. So you should avoid dichotomous questions because it doesn't give you much analysis about that specific subject matter. So you should avoid dichotomous questions in general. The third criteria is you should avoid being too broad. Should be broad, of course, but should not be too broad. If you remember when you discuss about research title, it should not be too broad, it should not be too narrow, right? But in the research design, when you come to the research design, it should be broad somehow. At the same time, it should be specific too. Meaning, should not be too broad, all right? But it should be broad and specific at the same time. When you say it should be broad, it means that it will enable you to discuss further. It will be possible to analyze the findings and so on, right? So it should make you to make analysis. So it should be broad. At the same time, it should be specific, meaning it should focus to one subject matters only. So you should be broad but specific at the same time. We'll discuss this with examples in the next slides. So just keep in mind these basic criteria. The fourth criteria is the research question should avoid double barrel questions. When you say double barrel questions, you should only ask one specific subject, one topic in one research question. You should not use or ask two different subjects or two different issues in one research question. So you should avoid double-barreled questions. And the last is when you design your research question, you should design it out of curiosity. You should not design it while you know the result, or while you know the answer. So it should be out of curiosity. You should avoid objectivity, right? So these are the basic criteria that you need to follow in designing your research questions. So I have provided you with two cases. The first one relates with the first problem statement, and the second case relates with the second problem statement. So you could evaluate the research questions based on the criteria that we have discussed in here. So how does the company develop its brand in considering the dimensions? That is the first research question, and you could evaluate this research question based on the criteria so that we have been discussing so far. So you could you know you should consider the criteria so far in designing your research question. So this is all about the research question that I have, and in the next lectures we'll be discussing the research design methodology. Basically we'll be discussing about research design, and we'll be discussing sampling, meaning we'll discuss what research design is, what type of research design is there, when you write your research design, what are the things that you need to consider, and when you write sampling, we'll do the same thing. Until then, stay safe and hope you enjoy the lecture. If you have any questions, we could discuss about it. So you are welcome anytime, and stay safe. Have a good day.